Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth there, I am Sydney Derrick, a librarian with the South Carolina Historical Society. Today's podcast is called Ballifo and the Carolina Corps, and we're going to learn a little bit about the story of one enslaved man during the Siege of Charleston in the American Revolution, as well as the story of an entire corps of formerly enslaved men who were taken/recruited from South Carolina and moved to the West Indies by the British. But before we get into all that, let's talk about upcoming events at the South Carolina Historical Society. We are hosting a family day on August 24th at our museum to show off our new kid-friendly exhibitions and interactive elements, including learning how to sail a 17th century schooner and creating a silhouette art scene using illustrations by Charleston Renaissance artist John Bennett. The day will also feature free admission to the museum, and that's at 100 Meeting Street in downtown Charleston. And save the date for our fall tour, which will be Sunday, October 27th, and we'll be exploring the sites in and around Gaffney, including private homes, churches, and the Cowpens National Battlefield. Of course, to stay up to date on all of our events, including our Friday architectural tours of the museum, head to our news and events tab at our website. And we have some archives announcements as well. We have several newly digitized collections available online, all relating to the Revolutionary War period. You can view letters from William Moultrie and the Continental Army records for the Southern Department on the Low Country Digital Library's website for free from anywhere in the world. And please, if you have a minute, leave a rating and review on this podcast wherever you're listening to it. Those really help others find out about our podcast and learn more about South Carolina history. Let's talk about our sources for the story of Ballifo and the Carolina Corps. We began with the manuscript collection of the South Carolina Historical Society, namely the Charleston family papers. We've also gathered information from the South Carolina Encyclopedia, a book, The History of the 1st West India Regiment by A.B. Ellis, The Sweet Hell Inside, a book by Edward Ball, an article by René Chartrand titled The British Army's Unknown Regular Africa West Indian Engineer and Service Corps, 1783 to the 1840s, published in the Journal of the Society for Army Historical Research, a blog post by Britain's National Army Museum on the West Indian Regiment, and a doctoral dissertation by Gary Selleck titled Black Men, Red Coats, the Carolina Corps, Race and Society in the Revolutionary British Atlantic, which is an excellent read on the men of the Carolina Corps, and of course goes way more in depth to the troops, their lives, and how they influenced the British military than we have time for in today's episode. So if this topic interests you, go find that piece online. The story we're discussing in today's episode begins in Charleston sometime during the Siege of Charleston in the first 2 years of the 1780s. In the Charleston family papers, there is an undated letter written to Isaac Charleston, who was a plantation owner, state legislator, and served as an officer in the 2nd and 6th regiments during the American Revolution. The letter is written by Reverend Robert Smith, who is another interesting story and was captured during the siege by the British, was later released on the condition that he not be anywhere near British military posts. So he went to Philadelphia for a while and then eventually moved back to Charleston after the war. But possibly while under arrest by the British and traveling with them, Smith writes to Isaac about meeting an enslaved man named Ballifo, who was enslaved by Isaac. At the time, Isaac owned Irishtown Plantation, which was on the eastern branch of the Cooper River, and he had also inherited the Bluff Plantation along with his siblings, and it sat on the western branch of the Cooper River. Now, both of these plantations are in today's Berkeley County in South Carolina, which is just north of Charleston. So Ballifo probably lived at one of these locations. So for this part of the podcast, our source is Reverend Smith's letter. So everything I say in the next couple of minutes is going to come straight from him. He writes that Ballifo had been captured by Lieutenant William Mackerel of the 64th British Regiment, emphasizing that Ballifo did not leave Harleston's plantation of his own volition, but was pressed into service for the British Army by Lieutenant Mackerel to look after the horses, and that Ballifo had, quote, frequently requested to go home. This sentiment is echoed by Lieutenant Mackerel, who told Reverend Smith that he didn't think the enslaved man would have left the plantation of his own volition. So Lieutenant Mackerel claims that he tried to give Ballifo back to Isaac Carlson by sending him a message about the whole situation, but when he didn't receive a response from Isaac on the offer, he lent Ballifo to another man, a man named Mr. Warner. So Reverend Smith is told that this Warner guy should be ready to return Ballifo soon, but by the end of the letter, Smith learns that Warner has actually traveled to Monk's Corner with the enslaved man, with Ballifo. So in the end, Smith has no current whereabouts of Ballifo, but he tells Isaac Harleston that he hopes he will escape the British soon and return to Harleston's plantation. In this same letter, it might be worth noting, Reverend Smith showed a similar level of concern about a horse that was also taken from Harleston's plantation. The horse was taken by Captain Crane of the British 33rd Regiment. Crane's servant was now in charge of the horse, and Smith writes that while the servant was willing to sell Smith the horse back for 5 guineas, Smith was, quote, unfortunately without even a shilling, let alone a guinea, end quote, so he could not afford to buy the horse back. Much like Ballifo, Reverend Smith also did not know what would become of the horse as of the writing of the letter. But that's the extent, really, of what we know of this man named Ballifo. We don't know his fate. We don't know what he was doing prior to this letter. He may have worked with horses on one of Harleston's plantations on the Cooper River prior to the siege, since Lieutenant Mackerel was using him for that purpose. We don't know if he ever left the plantation. We know of at least one young man who was enslaved by Isaac who did leave America with the British. A 16-year-old named Hercules is listed in the Black Loyalist Directory, which is edited by Graham Russell Hodges, as having been formerly owned by Isaac and traveling on a ship with the British in 1783 to Abaco. But I haven't been able to find any such lists or even wills where Ballifo was mentioned. We don't know if he ever returned to Irishtown or the Bluff, or if he ever really wanted to. But the name of the man who took him from Harleston's plantation, Lieutenant William Mackerel, is a name that we can follow from South Carolina, and it tells us what could have been Ballifo's fate, and what definitely was the fate of other enslaved men like him. When the British held power in Charleston during the siege from 1780 to 1782, they recruited or pressed into service African Americans, both free and enslaved. Many were used as laborers, like Ballifo was used to care for the horses, but some also saw combat. And by the time that the British were leaving South Carolina, they had promised freedom to some of the enslaved people in their employ, and they needed troops in St. Lucia in the West Indies. So, British officer Guy Carleton ordered those who were already in service to the British to be purchased from their owners and those who volunteered from that group to be enlisted in the army and sent to St. Lucia. There were about 264 men who took the British up on that offer, and guess who was one of the commanders of these men? Lieutenant William Mackerel, who originally captured Ballifo from Isaac Carlson's plantation. So this group of African Americans from South Carolina was now in service for the British Army in St. Lucia, and they were referred to as the Carolina Corps, or sometimes the Carolina Black Corps. At the end of the war, they were sent to Grenada, and the men were at first largely used for labor duties on the islands. But by 1791, the British governor of the island of Dominica requested troops to help quell a potential slave insurrection. And so a group from the Carolina Corps was sent. And this would not be the last slave insurrection these formerly enslaved men were sent to stop. Over the next few years, their home base remained in Grenada, but groups were sent on other missions around the British Caribbean islands. Often the Carolina Corps would have encountered people who looked like them in that they weren't white, and in some cases even had similar Caribbean or coastal African backgrounds, but whose language and culture was very different from their own. Another layer of distinction between the men of the Carolina Corps and the people that they were sometimes sent to patrol was that the men of the Corps were now free, which was not always the case with the people they encountered. The British helped highlight these differences between these groups by ensuring that the rations that the soldiers and enslaved people received were not equal. Was that to create resentment and keep the two groups from banding together, or was it to show respect to the Carolina Corps as soldiers of the British realm? Maybe a bit of both. It's important to point out here that although the British officers and commanders considered these men to be British, they did not consider them equal to white soldiers. This is shown by the amount of work required from the different groups, with more hard labor assigned to the Carolina Corps than regiments whose members were white. Eventually, though, this began to change. By 1790, the assignments given to the men of the Carolina Corps came to more closely resemble those of their white counterparts. Part of their mission, once the American Revolution ended, was to keep the peace among the different islands and ethnic groups that were found in the British West Indies, including with the people of St. Vincent, which was an autonomous community of Black people. The British thought that this island would be the perfect place to give to slave-holding loyalists who had fled their homes after America won its independence, and they expected a fight from the people of St. Vincent, so they sent the men of the Carolina Corps down there to stop any issues. But it ended up being an easy mission. No conflicts occurred during their time on the island of St. Vincent, and so they moved on. But not all of their missions would be so easy. In 1793, the men were moved from Grenada to Barbados and a couple of years later back to St. Lucia, all in attempts to quell the rebellions that began in the Caribbean, inspired by the French Revolution. In many of these attempts, however, they were unsuccessful. One of their last missions in this vein was in 1795, when the soldiers of the Carolina Corps were sent to stifle an uprising of enslaved people in St. Lucia and defend a British fort against a French attack. But they ultimately failed and ended up having to be evacuated by other British troops. By 1798, the regiment was 16 years old. The American Revolution was long over, and its numbers had dwindled severely. But while the strength of the regiment had faded, it was still a shining example for the British Army. The Corps was used as the model to raise other Black forces to fight for the British realm, including 2 ranger companies staffed with enslaved men purchased from West Indian plantations and led by white officers, just like the Carolina Corps was. But this time, these new, quote, recruits did not become free immediately, as their predecessors in the Carolina Corps had, which was a deviation from the British Army's successful model with the Corps. Eventually, the Corps combined with these other companies that sprang up later nearby to form the West Indian regiments. What few remaining members there were of the original Carolina Corps who were still fit for service were incorporated into the 1st West India Regiment, whose crest featured a Carolina laurel as a nod to its roots. But the remembrances from which they came did not stop there. Even into the early 1900s, the regiment marched to a song called So Early in the Morning, which had the alternate title South Carolina's A Sultry Climb. It describes the point of view of an enslaved person, talking about the work they did for the man who owned them, and then lamenting the owners. It uses words that would absolutely be considered inappropriate today, and the lyrics are a bit questionable in general too, but it seems to have been a well-known song at the time, this early 1900s time period. It was included in a 1903 book called British Songs for British Boys, a collection of 100 national songs. And the song was listed in a section that was titled, quote, American and Plantation Songs. So if you can picture it, this group of soldiers whose predecessors voluntarily joined an army for a foreign country in order to not be enslaved anymore were marching to a song lamenting the death of a man who owned slaves. And they marched on for a little while longer. The West India Regiment was in service to the Crown until 1927 and briefly revived from 1958 to 1962. Thus ends the long and storied history of this group of soldiers that first formed with enslaved men who saw an opportunity to escape their bondage and chose to fight for a country that many of them probably never even saw in order to see that freedom. So that's the story of Ballifo and the Carolina Corps, and that's going to do it for us this month. We'll be back in September with a continuation of our series on South Carolina's 4th Regiment as they prepare for battle with the British in Charleston in 1776. Until then, you can visit our archives on the 3rd floor of College of Charleston's Addlestone Library and visit our museum in the Fireproof Building at 100 Meeting Street in Charleston. You can also find us online at schistory.org and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. We'll see you next time.